Elara clutched the borrowed gown tighter around her as she stepped into the grand ballroom, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't belong here. The glittering chandeliers, the clinking of crystal glasses, the hum of elegant conversation, it was a world so far from her own that she felt like an intruder. "This is a terrible idea," she muttered under her breath, weaving through the crowd. The only reason she was here at all was because her roommate, Sophia, had begged her to take her place. "It's just a seat-filler job," Sophia had promised. "All you have to do is sit at a table, eat some fancy food, and act like you're supposed to be there." Elara had hesitated. She was drowning in student loans, exhausted from juggling 3 part-time jobs while struggling through her final year of university. A free meal in a luxurious hotel didn't seem like the worst way to spend an evening. But now, standing among the city's wealthiest elites, she realized just how wrong she had been. Swallowing hard, she found the number Sophia had given her table 7 and made her way over. The moment she slid into the chair, she felt a shift in the air. It was subtle but distinct, like someone noticing her presence. She turned slightly and her breath caught. The man sitting beside her was devastatingly handsome. Sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a suit that looked like it had been tailored to perfection. He exuded power, confidence, and something else, something unreadable. He looked at her with mild curiosity, his gaze flickering to the name card in front of her. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and smooth. Elara's stomach dropped. Had she just been caught? She stammered, forcing a polite smile. "I think I am." His lips twitched as if amused. "Are you?" Before she could respond, a waiter appeared, pouring champagne into the crystal flute in front of her. She grabbed it instinctively, taking a quick sip to steady herself. The man beside her leaned in slightly. "What's your name?" "Elara," she said cautiously. "Elara," he repeated as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "Interesting." She frowned. "Why is that interesting?" Instead of answering, he extended a hand. "Valentin Laurent." Elara froze. She wasn't the type to keep up with business moguls, but even she had heard of Valentin Laurent, the billionaire CEO of Laurent Enterprises, a man so powerful his name alone could make headlines. And she had just sat at his table. By mistake. Her pulse spiked. "Oh." His brow arched. "That's all you have to say." Nice to meet you." A slow, knowing look crossed his face, as if he had figured something out. "You're not here for business, are you?" Elara's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "Of course I am." "Really?" His voice was laced with amusement. "Then tell me, what do you do?" Panic flared in her chest. "Think, Elara, think." "I work in logistics." It came out as more of a question than a statement. Valentin chuckled, a deep, rich sound that sent a strange shiver down her spine. "Logistics, fascinating." Elara wanted to melt into the floor. This was a disaster. But before she could come up with a better excuse, the host of the gala stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, we celebrate the incredible achievements of our esteemed guests and the future of business innovation." Applause filled the room, and Elara took the opportunity to glance around. Every other person at the table looked like they belonged, polished, confident, powerful. She, on the other hand, was a broke student in a dress she couldn't afford, sitting beside one of the most influential men in the country. Valentin studied her, his gaze sharp yet unreadable. "You're not like the others." Elara swallowed. "Is that a bad thing?" His lips curved slightly. "Not at all." The dinner began, and as the waiters placed the first course in front of them, Elara forced herself to relax. Maybe if she just ate quietly and blended in, no one would notice she didn't belong. But Valentin didn't let that happen. Every few minutes he turned to her, asking questions. About her work, which she had to keep fabricating, her experiences, which she tried to keep vague, and her thoughts on the business world, which she barely knew anything about. And yet, despite her stumbling answers, he seemed entertained. "So," he said, swirling his wine, "tell me, Elara, what's the biggest challenge you've faced in your career?" She hesitated, lying was exhausting. And maybe it was the champagne, or the way his gaze held her so intently, but she found herself blurting out the truth. Trying to pass my advanced economics class without losing my mind. The moment the words left her mouth, she froze. Silence stretched between them. Then, to her utter shock, Valentin laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made several heads turn. Elara's face burned. Yeah. "You're a student," he said, as if confirming his suspicion. She exhaled in defeat. Yes. Valentin leaned back, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. You really did sit at the wrong table. Elara buried her face in her hands. I knew this was a bad idea. But instead of dismissing her, Valentin lifted his glass. To wrong tables. She peeked at him through her fingers. You're not mad. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. Why would I be? Because I don't belong here. His gaze darkened slightly as if he didn't like that answer. Who decides who belongs? Elara blinked. Before she could respond, the host called Valentin's name, announcing him as the keynote speaker. He stood buttoning his suit jacket, but before leaving he leaned down slightly, his voice low against her ear. Don't leave yet. Then he walked toward the stage, leaving Elara breathless and completely, utterly confused. Elara's pulse thrummed as Valentin strode onto the stage, commanding the room with an effortless authority that sent a ripple of anticipation through the audience. His presence was magnetic, his every movement deliberate. She had heard of powerful men before, but seeing one in action was something else entirely. The moment he began speaking, the room hushed. His voice was smooth yet commanding, weaving a speech that was both compelling and effortlessly confident. He spoke of innovation, of risk, of shaping the future rather than waiting for it to arrive. The audience hung on his every word, nodding in agreement, admiration evident in their expressions. Elara, on the other hand, was still reeling. She had been sitting beside him, talking to him as if he were just another person at the table, when in reality, he was the kind of man who shaped industries. The kind of man who could make or break careers with a single decision. And yet he had laughed at hers. The thought made her stomach tighten in an unfamiliar way. As the applause thundered at the conclusion of his speech, Valentin descended the stage, shaking hands as he made his way back to the table. Elara considered slipping away before he returned, but something rooted her to her seat. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. When he sat back down, he didn't immediately acknowledge the lingering stares from others at the table. Instead, his gaze found hers. Still here, he observed. Something about the way he said it sent a flutter through her chest. I figured I should at least finish my meal before getting escorted out, she quipped, trying to mask her unease. His lips curved slightly, but there was an intentness in his eyes now, a subtle shift that made the air between them feel charged. You thought I'd have you removed. She shrugged, unsure how to navigate this strange dance they were locked in. Wouldn't be the first time someone realized didn't belong and decided to fix the mistake. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his face, and yet you stayed. Elara hesitated. Would leaving have been better? Instead of answering, he reached for his glass, taking a measured sip, his gaze never wavering from hers. I don't think so. There was something about the way he said it that made her breath catch. Before she could respond, a woman approached the table, her presence sleek and poised. She greeted Valentin warmly, her demeanor polished and practiced. You were brilliant as always, Valentin, she said smoothly, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. Everyone is talking about your next move. He acknowledged her with a nod, but his response was brief. Glad you enjoyed it. Elara suddenly felt like an outsider intruding on a world that wasn't hers. The woman's gaze flickered toward her, a barely concealed curiosity in her expression. And you are, she asked, the words polite but edged with something else. Elara opened her mouth, but before she could answer, Valentin spoke first. Someone worth knowing. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. Elara too felt her breath hitch at the unexpected response. The woman's expression didn't falter, but there was a shift in her stance before she offered a tight smile. Well then, I'll leave you to it. As she walked away, Elara exhaled, not realizing she had been holding her breath. You didn't have to do that, she murmured. Valentin's gaze was steady. Do what? Make it sound like I belong here. You were already doing that yourself. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. I highly doubt that. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel like he saw something in her that even she didn't recognize. Before she could dwell on it, a waiter arrived with dessert, placing a delicate, artfully arranged plate in front of her. The sight of the rich chocolate creation momentarily distracted her, and she picked up her fork with a quiet sigh. I'll admit, she said after a moment, this is the nicest meal I've had in, well, ever. Valentin leaned back slightly, observing her as she took a bite. Then it was worth sitting at the wrong table. Elara chewed thoughtfully, then swallowed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? His brows lifted slightly. Enjoying what? Watching me flounder in an environment I clearly don't fit into. A slow, thoughtful pause. No, he said, his tone softer than before. I think I'm enjoying the fact that you don't try to fit in. The words landed unexpectedly, making her heartbeat stutter. She didn't know how to respond to that, so instead, she focused on her dessert, pretending that her fingers weren't gripping the fork just a little too tightly. As the evening continued, conversations flowed around them, but Valentin's attention never seemed to stray far from her. She wasn't sure what to make of it, or why he seemed so invested in a girl who had quite literally stumbled into his world by accident. And yet, there was no denying the pull between them, an unspoken thread weaving them into something neither of them had anticipated. As the evening progressed, the gala's energy shifted. The formalities had concluded and guests now mingled freely, glasses of champagne in hand, laughter and business deals intertwining in elegant conversation. But Elara remained seated, unsure of what to do next. She had made it this far without being exposed as an imposter, but she was running out of luck. Across from her, a pair of executives debated market strategies, and to her right, someone was name-dropping international investors. She couldn't contribute to these conversations. Then Valentin pushed his chair back slightly, tilting his head toward her. Walk with me. It wasn't a request, not really, more like a quiet command wrapped in intrigue. Elara hesitated. The smart thing to do would be to make her exit, to slip away before she embarrassed herself further. But there was something about the way he watched her, as if waiting to see whether she would accept the challenge. Against her better judgment, she rose. The moment they stepped away from the table, the atmosphere changed. The noise of the ballroom faded into a softer hum as Valentin guided her toward a quieter corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out beyond the glass, a sea of glittering lights beneath the night sky. For a moment, they simply stood there, the air between them charged with something unspoken. You don't like crowds, Valentin observed, sliding his hands into his pockets. Elara exhaled, glancing at him. I don't like feeling like I'm one wrong word away from being found out. He studied her, the sharpness in his gaze tempered with something more thoughtful. And yet, you haven't left. She gave a small shrug. I suppose I was curious. About what? She turned fully to face him. Why are you still talking to me? Most people in his position, powerful, wealthy, surrounded by people who actually belonged in this world, would have dismissed her the moment they realized she wasn't one of them. And yet, here he was, leading her away from the gala as if she were the most interesting person in the room. Valentin considered her question for a moment before answering, because you're not predictable. Elara let out a surprised laugh. That's one way to put it. His lips twitched, but his gaze remained steady. You're surrounded by people who spend their lives curating the perfect image, saying the right things, making the right connections. And then there's you. She crossed her arms. And what about me? You don't try to impress anyone. She raised an eyebrow. That's because I don't belong here. His expression didn't change, but there was a shift in his posture, a subtle intensity in the way he regarded her. You say that a lot. Because it's true. Valentin stepped closer, the space between them narrowing just enough for her breath to catch. Or maybe you're just afraid of what happens if you stop believing it. Elara didn't know how to respond to that. The weight of his words settled over her, unsettling in their accuracy. She had spent so much of her life trying to stay in the background, convinced that people like him, people with power, with influence, existed in a world entirely separate from hers. But Valentin didn't seem interested in keeping those boundaries intact. A passing waiter interrupted the moment, offering Valentin a fresh glass of champagne. He waved him off, his attention never breaking from her. "You're a student," he said, as if turning over a thought in his mind. "What are you studying?" She hesitated before answering, "Finance." Something flickered in his gaze. Interesting choice. Elara leaned against the glass, exhaling. It wasn't really a choice, more like a necessity. Valentin didn't press, but the silence seemed to invite an explanation. She sighed. "I couldn't afford to study what I wanted. Finance felt like the safest option, something practical, something that could lead to stability." His eyes softened just slightly. "And what would you have chosen?" She hesitated. No one had ever really asked her that before. "Architecture," she admitted finally. "I wanted to design things, buildings, spaces, places that made people feel something." Valentin tilted his head slightly. "Then why didn't you?" She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Because dreams don't pay the bills." For the first time since sitting at the wrong table, Elara felt oddly exposed, not because she didn't belong, but because he was seeing parts of her she rarely shared. Valentin was quiet for a moment. Then, as if making a decision, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black card. Without a word, he handed it to her. Elara frowned, glancing down at it. His name was embossed in silver, along with his direct contact information. "What is this?" she asked warily. "A way to fix what shouldn't have been broken," he said simply. She looked up at him. "I don't understand." His expression was unreadable. "You will." And with that, he turned, walking back toward the ballroom, leaving Elara standing there, her heart racing, her mind spinning, and a business card that felt heavier than it should have in her hand. Elara stood frozen in place, the weight of Valentin's business card pressing against her palm like it held some hidden gravity. Everything about this night had been unexpected, but this was something else entirely. She traced the embossed lettering with her thumb, the reality of what had just happened washing over her. A billionaire CEO had not only spent the entire evening engaged in conversation with her, but he had also given her a direct line to him. And for what? The thought unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. Before she could analyze it further, a gentle breeze drifted through the corridor as a set of glass doors opened, revealing a rooftop terrace bathed in the soft glow of city lights. Without fully realizing it, her feet carried her forward. The crisp night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the gala. She rested her hands against the railing, looking out over the skyline. The world from up here felt different, expansive, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. A deep voice behind her shattered the fragile quiet. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared." Elara turned, and there he was again. Valentin stood just inside the terrace doors, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He had loosened his tie, the crisp lines of his suit still immaculate, but there was a shift in him, something almost relaxed. She exhaled a quiet laugh. "I needed air." He stepped closer, his presence effortlessly commanding. "And yet you didn't leave." Elara tilted her head, studying him. "Would you have let me?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "No." The honesty in his voice sent a spark of something electric through her, and she quickly looked back at the skyline, needing a moment to collect herself. "This is your world," she murmured. "Nights like this, people like them, you fit into all of it so effortlessly." Valentin was silent for a beat before answering, his voice lower now. You think that means I belong to it? She glanced at him, surprised by the question, don't you? His lips pressed together as if weighing his words carefully. I was raised in it. I learned its rules, mastered them, but fitting into something doesn't mean you belong to it. Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. She shifted, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. So what does belong mean to you? Valentin's fingers curled slightly at his side, his eyes locked onto hers as if searching for something. Then, as if making a decision, he closed the distance between them. It means, he said, his voice unreadable, choosing something because it calls to you, because it feels like home. Elara's breath hitched. The city stretched out behind them, endless and glittering, but in that moment nothing felt more significant than the space between them. She swallowed hard, and have you chosen that yet? His gaze flickered to her lips for the briefest second before returning to her eyes. I think I have. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Everything about him was overwhelming, the way he looked at her, the quiet intensity in his voice, the way he made her feel as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. She felt the pull, the undeniable gravity between them, but she also knew what this was. A fleeting moment in a world she didn't belong to. Elara, his voice was quiet, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She forced herself to take a step back, needing distance before she lost herself completely. I should go. Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable, but he didn't stop her. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek pen, and took her hand before she could react. Her skin burned where his fingers brushed against hers as he lifted her palm, and with deliberate precision wrote something in dark ink. The moment he let go, she looked down, a number. Call me, he said, his voice steady, when you're ready. Elara swallowed, her fingers curling slightly around the number as if she could somehow hold onto the moment itself. She should have said something, anything, but instead she turned, walking away before she could change her mind. And as she stepped into the elevator, her heart beat wild in her chest. She knew one thing for certain. Nothing about her life would ever be the same again. Elara sat on the worn couch in her tiny apartment, staring at the numbers scrawled across her palm. The ink had begun to smudge, but the numbers remained legible, a stark reminder of the night before. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the way Valentin had looked at her, the weight of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice. Call me when you're ready. She wasn't ready, not for whatever this was. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Sophia, her roommate, peeked inside, her expression curious. You've been sitting there like a statue since you got home, Sophia noted, stepping inside with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Elara before plopping down beside her. So, are we going to talk about the fact that you spent half the night with Valentin Laurent? Elara groaned, rubbing her temple. I don't even know what to say. Sophia leaned in, eyes gleaming. Start with the part where he gave you his number. Elara exhaled, setting her coffee down. It doesn't make sense, he's Valentin Laurent, and a brilliant, hard-working woman who somehow landed in the middle of a billionaire's orbit, Sophia finished. And from what I saw online, he didn't seem in a hurry to let you go. Elara stiffened, online. Sophia grabbed her phone, unlocking it with a flourish. You made headlines. Elara's stomach twisted as Sophia turned the screen toward her. A photo from the gala dominated the feed, Valentin leaning in close, speaking to her with an intensity that made it look far more intimate than it had been. The caption underneath was worse. Mystery woman captures Valentin Laurent's attention at exclusive gala. Who is she? Elara groaned, burying her face in her hands. This is a disaster. Sophia nudged her, or it's an opportunity. Elara shot her a look. For what? Public humiliation. For something different, something new. Elara wanted to argue, but the truth wedged itself too deeply in her chest. Was it really so impossible? She glanced at her palm again, the ink fading but still there. Maybe she had already made her choice. The phone rang only once before a voice answered. Elara. She inhaled sharply. He had answered so quickly as if he had been waiting. She hesitated, gripping her phone tighter. I wasn't sure if I should call. A pause then, but you did. She swallowed, I don't know why. I do. His voice was steady, certain, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Elara, he continued, meet me for dinners. She hesitated, Valentin. Just dinner. The simplicity of it made refusing harder. After a long pause, she exhaled, okay. The restaurant was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the soft hum of conversation filling the space. Elara sat across from Valentin, trying not to feel overwhelmed. He looked completely at ease, his presence commanding yet oddly grounding. Are you always this persistent? She asked, breaking the silence. A glint of something unreadable crossed his face, when something is worth pursuing. Her stomach tightened. The waiter arrived, placing a dish in front of her. She had barely glanced at the menu before Valentin had ordered for both of them, his confidence unnerving yet oddly reassuring. She picked up her fork, studying him. You're not used to people questioning you, are you? He considered her for a moment before answering, not often. She took a bite, savoring the unexpected richness of the dish. Then why do you let me? Something in his expression shifted. Because you don't ask for the sake of hearing yourself speak, you ask because you want to know. She set her fork down, his words settling deep. Why me, Valentin? She asked quietly. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Because you were never supposed to be at that table, and yet you belonged there more than anyone else. Her breath caught. She had no response, no way to deflect or dismiss it. Because for the first time, she wondered if maybe he was right. Elara's fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, her pulse a steady drum beneath her skin. The weight of Valentin's words lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. She had spent so much of her life believing she was an outsider, someone who had to work twice as hard just to be noticed, let alone belong. And yet here he was, telling her that she had every right to be in a world she never thought was hers. She set her glass down with deliberate care, her gaze meeting his. You talk like you know me, she said, not as a challenge but as an observation. Valentin's expression remained unreadable, though something in his eyes deepened. I know what it looks like when someone refuses to take up space they deserve. Her breath hitched slightly. She wasn't used to being seen like this, not just acknowledged, but truly seen. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them had fully named yet. Before she could respond, the waiter returned to clear their plates. Valentin leaned back slightly, his focus never straying from her as the table was reset for dessert. Elara exhaled, willing herself to think clearly. So what happens now? Valentin's brow lifted slightly, as if he had been waiting for her to ask. That depends. On what? He reached for his own glass, his movements slow and deliberate. On whether you're ready to stop convincing yourself that this is temporary. Her stomach tightened. She wanted to tell him that it was temporary, that this entire evening, this entire connection was bound to dissolve the moment reality set in. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. She didn't want it to. She swallowed, searching for steady ground. And if I don't know how to do that? Valentin tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then with a quiet certainty he said, then I'll show you. The word settled over her not as a promise but as something more solid, a certainty. She wasn't sure how long they sat there, the rest of the restaurant fading into the background. Time felt irrelevant, stretched thin between words and silences that carried just as much weight. Eventually, Valentin signaled for the check, and before she could even consider reaching for her purse, he had already taken care of it. Elara wasn't surprised. As they stepped outside, the city air was crisp, humming with life. A sleek black car was already waiting at the curb, the driver standing by the door. Valentin turned to her, his gaze searching. "Let me take you home." She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wasn't sure she trusted herself. But then, before she could overthink it, she nodded. The car ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. Valentin sat beside her, his presence steady, his attention entirely on her. When they reached her apartment building, the car rolled to a smooth stop. Valentin exhaled slowly before shifting toward her, his expression unreadable. "If I asked you to see me again, would you say yes?" Elara's pulse thudded in her ears. She had spent so long convincing herself that people like him didn't look twice at people like her. But here he was, asking for more. And for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Yes." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something almost like relief before he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, a quiet promise in the touch. "I'll see you soon, then." And with that, she stepped out of the car, her heart pounding, knowing without a doubt that nothing in her life would ever be the same again.